Everything begins in the western lands of the continent of Mahidora, where 4 years have passed since Emperor Cordian ascended the throne of the Ashur Empire and began conquering all the neighboring kingdoms. Caught in the middle of this terrible whirlwind of war was a mercenary who preferred to hide his past from everyone. He seemed to carry secrets that were incredibly deep. Suddenly, the story flashes back to when young Elric is caught off guard by the sudden announcement that he must be married immediately. Not understanding anything, he questions his father about it, who simply explains that his bride-to-be will be the daughter of Baron Webben. The father continues with details, saying the young lady is only 16 years old, extremely beautiful, and has a hobby of tending to her garden. Shortly after, the doors to the great meeting hall begin to slowly open before them. Elric's father believes the two make a good match, and that is how, at only 14 years of age, the boy sees his destiny change drastically. He ended up engaged to a young noble without even seeing her face, which left him completely stunned by the entire situation. Elric simply could not process the idea that he was actually about to get married out of the blue. Already dressed for the grand ceremony, he still tries to understand what is happening while observing the massive angel statue in the chapel. At that moment, he wonders why such an important noblewoman from such a distinguished lineage would accept this union. After all, it didn't seem to make sense for someone from high society to marry the heir of a simple merchant family like his. His thoughts are interrupted when the bride finally appears in the hall and greets him with impressive elegance. Elric stands completely paralyzed and blushing as he looks at the young woman's face, only managing to whisper the name Tyria. She formally introduces herself as Tyria Webben while walking gracefully toward him in her beautiful wedding gown. The girl's beauty is overwhelming, with shiny golden hair reminiscent of wheat fields and green eyes that sparkle like spring buds. Her skin is extremely fair and delicate, contrasting perfectly with lips as red as cherries. If Elric had to define her in just one sentence, he would say she is a mysterious and incredibly refined young lady. Suddenly, someone taps Elric on the shoulder to remind him to introduce himself, pulling him out of that trance of admiration. A bit awkward, he bows before her and says he hopes they can have a good life together from then on. Although the boy's mind is a total mess with how fast everything is moving, one single clear thought manages to stand out in the middle of the chaos. He realizes that starting from that solemn moment at the altar, he will spend the rest of his days beside this very special person. Looking back, Elric understands that the overwhelming feeling he had when he saw her was his first love. When it comes time to exchange rings, he feels so shy about the goofy smile trying to escape his face that he has to make an effort to disguise it. He makes a more serious expression just to contain the immense joy he feels inside during the vow. However, focused only on his own happiness, he was completely oblivious to a crucial detail about his bride. Elric didn't even suspect that this entire forced situation could be deeply hurting Tereya's feelings. Time passes and the scene changes to a night of heavy rain outside the family's grand mansion. Inside one of the rooms, a single lit candle burns slowly in the silence of the night. Elric fidgets restlessly with his wedding ring, still trying to digest how everything happened so fast. He smiles shyly while lying in bed, thinking that such an elegant young lady is now actually his wife. But the memory of his father announcing that the bride would be the daughter of Baron Wyben echoes strongly in his mind. And as the memories of that conversation return, the smile on the young man's face begins to fade. After all, no matter how hard he tries to analyze the situation from every possible angle, none of it seems to make any real sense. Restless in bed, Elric decides to ask the housekeeper directly why a noble would agree to marry the heir of a merchant family. The housekeeper, named Rhonda, looks away and hesitates quite a bit, clearly appearing uncomfortable with that question. Noticing her reaction, Elric insists and begs her to tell him the whole truth once and for all. Rhonda remains silent for a few moments, appearing to struggle internally against the weight of that secret. She finally reveals to the young master that this is nothing more than a pure marriage of convenience. The housekeeper explains that although the Wibben family had a lot of fame and wealth in the past, today they are buried in debt and without funds to survive. Because of this, Elric's father demanded the marriage as a condition to pay off all the nobles' debts and provide the necessary financial support. She adds that through this union, the Portman merchant family will finally be able to climb in status and join the nobility. Shocked by the revelation, Elric asks if this means the girl was basically sold to them, receiving only Rhonda's sorrowful silence as an answer. He falls into despair when he realizes the terrible reality behind his marital bliss. Consumed by immense guilt, he begins to question himself in anguish about what his own father was capable of doing. Unable to contain his emotions, Elric opens the bedroom doors with force and leaves the worried housekeeper behind. He begins to run desperately to the castle corridors with an urgent need to give explanations. Everything the boy desires most in that moment of pure despair is to find Tierra to offer his sincere apologies for what happened. He races against time, extremely distressed, looking for any excuse or justification he can give to ease that terrible situation. Exhausted from running, the boy has to rest his hand on the hallway wall while trying to catch his breath. He leans over, completely tired, but his determination to speak with her prevents him from giving up at that moment. With his heart racing and sweat dripping down his face, he continues gasping for air as he approaches her room. Finally, he arrives in front of the large and luxuriously decorated doors of the chambers where she is staying. As he touches the wood to open it, Elric notices a small gap and hears a muffled sound coming from inside. Peeking in silence through the crack in the door, he is totally paralyzed to hear small sobs of crying. On the other side, young Tyria has a completely flushed face and is shedding tears of deep sadness. She appears curled up on the floor of the dark room, hugging her own legs while crying softly in her loneliness. The sound of that suffering breaks Elric's heart, and he is in shock to realize the deplorable state of his bride. At the exact moment he sees her crying in such a painful way, the boy decides to take a step back and walk away. That was when he made a drastic decision and a silent promise that he would find a way to annul that unhappy marriage. The scene changes to the next day, where we see Elric's father signing new business documents as calmly as can be. While the man works quietly in his luxurious office, quick and noisy footsteps echo from outside. Suddenly, Elric opens the doors with extreme violence and shouts for his father in a tone of pure revolt. Without any hesitation, the boy demands immediately that arrangement marriage be cancelled once and for all. He confronts his father directly about the fact that Tyria was purchased just to save her family from financial bankruptcy. With eyes full of despair and anguish, the young man begs from the bottom of his heart for his father to change his mind. However, the man only turns slowly and pronounces his son's name in an extremely cold and sharp tone. He stares fixedly at the boy with a terrifying countenance and orders him to stop acting like a spoiled child immediately. His father stands imposingly and reminds his son that they now belong to the nobility and that he needs to start behaving as such. That extremely cold look, devoid of any trace of affection, hits the boy as if it were a physical blow. This makes Elric remember, with much bitterness, the harsh and sad reality in which he had always lived inside that house. After all, he had always carried the weight of being seen by his own father as the son blamed for his mother's passing during childbirth. To the patriarch, Elric was never more than a mere puppet, tool without his own will, used only to ensure the family's rise. Faced with such coldness and contempt, the boy realizes that there is no more room for dialogue and decides to turn his back on his father for good. He finally accepts the painful truth that he never meant anything more than a mere instrument of interest to his own progenitor. It is in this moment of deep disappointment that he makes a firm decision that he needs to disappear from that house as soon as possible. He would do this both to free the poor girl who was sold for money and to ruin his father's plans for greatness once and for all. For his escape to work, the young man decides to abandon the Portman surname and everything that connected him to that ambitious family. That same night, an extremely heavy rain begins to fall relentlessly over the vast wheat fields of the region. Under the strong storm, the boy begins his escape journey without looking back, carrying only a backpack and a sword at his waist. While walking in the darkness, he still finds himself questioning the real reasons that made Tyria cry so much in that room. Elric wonders if she suffered from having been sold, from leaving her homeland, or if she cried just because she hated the idea of marrying him. But he knows very well that no matter how hard he tries to find those answers, there is no way to turn back on his decision. With that, he pushes those doubts out of his head and decides to move forward with his escape toward the unknown. Many years pass, and the story takes us to a huge and imposing stone fortress under a gray, stormy sky. A muscular man with grayish hair notices an approach in the area and asks in surprise who is there in the middle of the rain. Upon seeing the mysterious young man standing before him, the man asks if he really came to that fortress to become a mercenary. With a look full of determination and without showing any sign of hesitation, the boy answers that he did in a very firm manner. He then introduces himself using his new war code name and says that from that day on he only answers to Casca, completely abandoning his past. He spent 10 long years surviving on the battlefield and brandishing his sword with a relentless ferocity. Wandering constantly from one conflict zone to another, he ended up being known everywhere as the feared sword demon. That entire frightening reputation was, in truth, the only secret that remained of that fragile boy who once called himself Elric. Now he observes the golden horizon after the end of one more violent combat, reflecting on his long journey of blood. Despite his relentless fame, his gaze still carries a deep melancholy about the lonely path he chose to follow. In the distance, a huge enemy troop begins to position itself in combat formation for the next inevitable attack. However, the fearless warrior positions himself completely alone in the canyon to face the advancing opposing army. He wields his heavy gleaming blade which shines intensely against the last rays of the sunset. In the blink of an eye, the warrior executes a quick and overwhelming movement, slicing through the enemies with precise strikes. With his face stained with blood, Casca maintains a cold expression, totally focused on his own survival in the middle of the chaos. The story then takes us inside a busy tavern full of people chatting happily about the latest events. The owner of the establishment looks surprised toward the entrance upon hearing the doorbell ring softly. He soon gives a warm welcome to the new customer who has just entered the place carrying a walking cane. It is Elric, who now wears common civilian clothes and uses a cane to move around due to his injuries, walking with a serious countenance and a noticeable limp. He crosses the room in silence under the attentive and curious gaze of several customers drinking nearby. Some patrons recognize him immediately and start whispering if he isn't the legendary sword demon who had been missing from the distant battlefields. They seem astonished and wonder if the feared warrior ended up suffering some irreparable injury to his leg to be in that debilitated state. Elric approaches the counter, and the bartender, worried about his state, asks what happened that was serious enough to leave him limping like that. The young man downplays the situation, explaining it was just a small battle incident, something the attendant considers quite common in the life of any veteran fighter. While picking up a newspaper to read, the young man comments calmly that he will have to live with this physical limitation for a good part of his life. Suddenly, Elric squeezes the newspaper paper with extreme force upon coming across a shocking and unexpected piece of news on the page he was reading. The tavern owner notices the drastic mood swing in his customer and calls out to him, startled by that sudden reaction of silent fury. But the young man is completely paralyzed and with eyes reddened by pure indignation focused on the article in the periodical. The news carried precisely the portrait and name of his late father, Hovan Portman, printed in a formal manner in the obituary. Shortly after, the shrill sound of a steam train whistle echoes through the mountains under the golden light of the sunset. The locomotive travels swiftly along the tracks while cutting through the beautiful mountainous landscape of that peaceful region. Sitting comfortably inside his cabin, Elric observes thoughtfully the immensity that passes quickly by the window glass of the train car. He reflects with bitterness on how his late father's face was printed in such a discreet and forgotten corner of that piece of newspaper. The official announcement confirmed the death of Haven Portman, the person who caused the most painful and traumatic marks in his entire past. Elric remembers when he ran away from home at 14 years of age and how, deep in his soul, he still held the naive hope that his father would look for him in some way. He recognizes that, for being just a scared and immature boy at the time, that was a childish feeling without much practical sense. However, even looking back today, he still thinks that that glimmer of hope was not entirely unfounded in his child's mind. After all, despite having been treated only as a puppet of interest, and his father being the indirect culprit for his mother's passing, there was still an inevitable bond between the two. He knows that no matter how hard he tried to deny everything with his immense resentment, he was still, in the end, the blood heir of that man. In some corner of his bitter heart, the boy desperately wished that his father had shown at least a single drop of genuine affection for him before the end. But he knows that this was just a childish illusion, and now that the man has died, the very target of his resentment has simply ceased to exist in the world. He feels that today only a cowardly version of himself remains, using his father's passing as a mere excuse to return quietly to his childhood home. With his heart taken by regrets and a deep emptiness in his chest, the warrior hears the train brakes screech as it approaches his former hometown. The train finally stops at its final destination at the Wiven station, the exact location where his entire history of suffering began 10 years ago. The wind blows softly through the immense and shiny golden wheat fields under the reddish sky of the sunset. Elric disembarks on the platform and takes a deep breath of the air of his former land with a look quite melancholic and distant from everything. He walks slowly along the dirt road between the wheat fields, noting that absolutely nothing has changed there after an entire decade of absence. The streets remain peaceful and painted with the reddish tone characteristic of the dry autumn leaves that fall silently from the trees. He sees local residents working in the harvest without any rush in that setting. It seemed extremely welcoming, but at the same time very distant from his violent reality of wars. The tranquil atmosphere of the village shows no trace of that unbearable life or death tension that he faced daily on the battlefields. He continues his slow walk, marking the beat with a rhythmic and painful sound of his limping steps hitting the dirt ground. Suddenly, a light, cool breeze touches his face, bringing him a sense of instant peace and a discreet smile on his lips after so long. The immense wheat fields, which were always the greatest symbol of the Weeben family's property, remain completely untouched by the passage of time. This golden vision brings to the surface the happy memories of his youth when he used to play hide and seek in a relaxed manner with the other boys of the village. He also remembers with fondness when he was scolded by the housekeepers for coming back with his clothes all covered in dirt after his daily adventures. With every new step taken on that rustic road, the memories of the past seem to resurface before his eyes with impressive clarity and vividness. He mutters thoughtfully about the strength of these memories, trying to understand the contradictory feelings that they still awaken in his wounded chest. But the warrior's slow steps are suddenly interrupted when he spots something unexpected further ahead on the dusty trail. The young man focuses his attentive gaze towards some female voices that begin to echo softly through the middle of the wheat field. He cannot avoid thinking about the sweet Mysteria and wondering if she managed to live well and happy during all these years that he was away. Elric smiles, resigned to himself, imagining that someone so beautiful and graceful must surely have already been courted and married to a good, high-class partner. It is at that instant that he notices an extremely delicate hand touching the golden ears of wheat gently, very close to where he is. His eyes widen in absolute shock upon hearing the voice of a maid shout, "Tyria!" named loudly in the middle of the plantation. He turns around trembling and sees, a few meters away, Tyria herself carrying a bundle of harvested wheat while a servant runs, worried to try to help her with the weight. The housekeeper is startled to notice the presence of that stranger with a cane watching them and turns with an intrigued and apprehensive expression toward Elric. Elric observes the young lady closely, almost unable to believe that he is before Tyria again after so much time. At that moment, the maid approaches running and shouts, worried for her mistress while walking hurriedly. The young man is extremely confused, wondering how on earth she could still be living in such a simple way on that farm, totally incredulous of that situation. Elric asks why she is still there. Tyria, a bit awkward, answers that the reason for her being there is because she still remains his legitimate wife by law. Upon hearing that calm assertion, the young man feels like the biggest fool in the world for all his thoughtless attitudes of youth. He realizes how naive he was to believe that that forced marriage would simply be annulled by his sudden disappearance. After all, if that arranged union could be undone so easily, she would never have been sold to his family from the start. He questions himself for the selfish actions in the past ended up imprisoning and stealing for good the last drop of freedom from that poor woman. The young man realizes that in the end he was incapable of acting in and correct way with the people around him. He realizes that he failed miserably in protecting his own pride and worse yet in providing any kind of support or respect to the woman he had married. He sees himself only as a cowardly man for having fled his family responsibilities in such a childish manner. While he spent 10 years fighting and brandishing his sword aimlessly on the battlefields, she endured all the consequences in silence. He wonders how lonely, difficult, and painful her life must have been throughout all these years of total abandonment in the mansion. Although he feels he urgently needs to ask for her forgiveness for everything, the young man begins to doubt his own real intentions. He questions himself if he even has the right to do that, and if she would really be willing to accept the apologies of someone who left her behind. Completely awkward and quite embarrassed, the young man tries to stutter some words to try to start a conversation. Tyria just watches him in absolute silence, maintaining a calm and indecipherable expression under her large straw hat. Without showing any sign of irritation, she suggests in a practical manner that the two go into the house to talk better about the matter. Shortly after, she begins to walk calmly back toward the mansion, allowing him to follow her closely behind on the dirt road. Elric accompanies her in silence, feeling extremely tense and uncomfortable with all that unexpected calm on her part. Deep down, he desperately wished that she would at least get angry or shout at him for all the suffering he caused. After all, her extreme indifference seemed to hide a hurt much worse than any temperamental explosion of anger. While they walk toward the grand property under the reddish sky, he continues questioning himself about what really awaits him from then on. Suddenly, he notices movement coming from the entrance of the house, and turns around quickly with a look of surprise. The young man's eyes widen upon noticing a very familiar figure coming out to the main door of the mansion. Tyria continues advancing toward the entrance while the young man remains a little set back on the dirt road due to his injured leg. She notices the young man's obvious hesitation, interrupts her steps, and asks in a gentle manner if he is not going to accompany her inside. Caught by surprise, by the unexpected delicacy in her voice, Eilric swallows hard and tries to recover quickly from the shock. He answers that he is already going and grips his cane firmly, quickening his awkward step to try to catch up with her. They finally enter the imposing mansion and one of the young servants politely asks for them to wait a moment while she goes to call the butler. Tyria waits patiently in the entrance hall, still holding firmly onto the bundle of golden wheat she harvested in the field. The young servant withdraws from there quickly, opening the large internal doors to fulfill the received order. Alric takes advantage of the brief moment of silence to observe in detail the luxurious environment around him. He is impressed to realize that even after 10 years away, the interior of the imposing mansion remains absolutely identical to what it was before. Each small decorative detail of the place evokes deep and nostalgic memories of his turbulent childhood inside there. Even the exact number of windows and the location of each stain on the walls come to his mind with impressive clarity. Faced with so much nostalgia and upon realizing that time seems to have simply frozen there, the young man lets out a light and discreet smile. However, his moment of reflection is suddenly interrupted when a firm female voice asks who he is. Alric turns around surprised toward that austere voice that sounds extremely familiar to his childhood ears. An elegant woman wearing glasses and formal housekeeper attire approaches slowly and questions with seriousness who he came to visit. The young man is in absolute shock to recognize that the woman before him is none other than Rhonda, his old trusted housekeeper. He realizes that even after an entire decade, she has not changed absolutely anything in her austere appearance and impeccable posture. With a light smile on his lips, the young man asks, in a relaxed manner, if she really cannot recognize him. Rhonda watches him with quite a bit of attention, visibly confused by that intimate question coming from a complete stranger with a cane. However, upon focusing her eyes well on the young man's striking features, she finally realizes who he is and widens her eyes in complete shock of recognition. Rhonda is completely stunned and stammers the title of young master while watching the young man smile back with affection. With trembling hands and tears in her eyes, she asks if that man before her is really her dear boy Elric. He hugs her warmly and says in a soft manner that it has been a long time and that he is finally back home. Holding back his tears, the dedicated housekeeper is moved to confirm that the young man she helped raise has returned safe and sound. She comments, astonished, that he has changed so much in these 10 years that it became almost impossible to recognize him at first. The young man smiles gently and agrees that he really has changed quite a bit in this time, making that reaction perfectly understandable. But suddenly, an extremely intriguing thought strikes Elric's mind, leaving him thoughtful and confused. He remembers perfectly when Tyria stated moments ago that she remained on the farm because she was his legitimate wife. The young man reflects on the fact of now being a rustic man who spent 10 years fighting on bloody battlefields. Rhonda notices the young man's sudden distraction and asks, worried, if there is something wrong happening with him at that instant. He concludes that his physiognomy has changed so much that even the housekeeper, who cared for him like a mother, had immense difficulty identifying him at first. Knowing this, the young man wonders how it would be possible for his bride to know who he was without any hesitation. Sweat drips down his forehead while he tries to decipher this great mystery that involves Tyria's behavior. He simply cannot understand how the young woman was able to recognize his face at first sight after so much time away. Time passes and the scene changes to the interior of a luxurious room in the mansion where the white curtains sway softly with the wind. Tyria appears standing in front of the huge glass window, observing silently the beautiful landscape of the sunset. She follows with attention the conversation between Elric and the housekeeper that occurs right below in the property's garden. The young man feels that he's being watched from up there, turns around quickly, and ends up blushing quite a bit with the situation. Upon noticing that she was caught spying, the young woman recoils, startled, and brings her hand to her chest with a racing heart. She tries to catch her breath while leaning on the wall, and her face becomes completely red with shyness. The story then highlights the large and striking scar that Elric carries on the back of his neck. Besides focusing on his long brown hair and his deep gaze that carries marks of suffering, to Tyria, absolutely nothing seemed to have changed in the essence and gaze of that boy she knew so well in childhood. Later, Elric relaxes in a luxurious hot water bathtub, but he still remains intrigued by the mystery of the recognition. While taking his bath, he tries to find some plausible explanation for how his wife was able to identify him so easily after 10 years. He finally decides to get out of the warm water, causing a light noise upon stepping on the wet floor of the bathroom. The young man wears his white robe and begins to tie the belt, but takes a big scare upon hearing the door open suddenly. He turns his head confused, widening his eyes before the unexpected presence that arises right in front of him. It is Tyria who enters the environment quietly, wearing only a white towel wrapped around her body after her bath. Upon noticing his presence there in the same private space, her cheeks turn red with shame instantly. Desperate with the discovery, the girl tries to cover herself more and starts to stutter several apologies for the misunderstanding. Seeing that she is about to cry from so much embarrassment, Elric tries to calm her down in a hurry so she does not panic. He gestures nervously and asks her not to shed tears because of that embarrassing situation. But the tense and shy atmosphere between the two newlyweds seems to only increase with every second of silence in that steamy room. To make the situation worse, a young maid with red hair opens the door holding a basket of clothes and lets out an ear-splitting scream upon seeing the intimate scene. In complete panic with the catch, the servant throws everything on the floor and runs out as fast as she can to the mansion's hallways. She screams desperately for help from outside, unable to understand what on earth is happening inside that room. In an extremely quick reaction to protect his wife from curious eyes, Elric pulls Cherie close and hugs her firmly. However, this unexpected and sudden physical contact leaves both with faces even redder with pure shame. With eyes full of tears from the shock, the young woman can only manage to stammer her maid's name in panic. Trying to get around the situation in any way, the young man tries to invent a lame excuse that he only held her so she won't fall on the slippery floor. The story then transports us back to the dark times of war on the Chevre defense line where the 5th Guard Regiment is positioned. One of the fearless fighters observes the horizon with a sharp and relentless gaze in the middle of the strong rain falling. From the enemy side emerges the feared knight of the Imperial Army's vanguard, LeBron, leading the elite assault group with a macabre smile on his face. With war cries echoing everywhere, the troops receive orders to advance with everything to annihilate the local defense forces. LeBron taunts the adversaries by shouting, raising his massive sword, and guaranteeing that he will hack each one of them without any mercy. In an extremely brutal attack, the powerful enemy commander begins to knock down several guards at once, spreading blood across the wet earth. Desperate before such disparity of power, the surviving soldiers shout that it is impossible to defeat that armored warrior. Without another viable alternative to avoid a massacre, the officers order the immediate withdrawal of all units behind the defensive line. But contrary to all that generalized panic, the fearless Kasha walks calmly toward the danger, with his heavy sword resting on his shoulder. The enemy's soldiers watch the mysterious warrior from a distance and wonder if he is just another insignificant mercenary hired by Shavor. Completely oblivious to the adversary's whispers, the young man adopts his combat stance and raises his heavy sword. Kasha maintains his cold gaze focused on the opponents, demonstrating an impressive calm before the imminent battle. Without losing time, one of the fearless Imperial soldiers advances fiercely toward him with his sword held high and a sadistic smile on his face. However, the protagonist blocks the attack with extreme ease and already prepares to deliver a devastating counterattack. He holds his massive blade with absolute firmness, maintaining an imperturbable expression while dominating the confrontation. With a precise and lethal movement, he hits the enemy's neck, making the blood gush intensely in the middle of the rain. The injured soldier drops his weapon and falls to his knees on the ground, completely defeated by the young man's overwhelming power. Kasha spins his sword quickly and decapitates the opponent with a single, clean, and merciless cut. The bloodied helmet of the soldier rolls to the mud before his companions, spreading panic among the Imperial troops. The other soldiers who watch the scene stand paralyzed by pure terror and begin to break out in a cold sweat before that monstrous strength. Standing beside the fallen body, the warrior introduces himself solemnly as Kasha, the legendary mercenary knight of Shavor. He challenges the remaining enemies to advance if they have the courage, guaranteeing that he will hack down to the last of them without any hesitation. But suddenly, a chill runs down his spine when he feels a deadly threat approaching quickly. The protagonist reacts at the same instant and activates his mana shield to try to protect himself from the surprise attack. However, a powerful projectile pierces his protective barrier with violence and hits his left knee squarely. Feeling excruciating pain, the young man falls to his knees and uses his own sword as support so as not to collapse on the bloody ground. Kasha grinds his teeth and looks up with much difficulty, trying to identify the origin of that devastating shot. At the top of a nearby cliff, two mysterious silhouettes observe silently the unfolding of the battle down below. It is a duo with eccentric clothing and masks, where the woman holds a sniper rifle that is still smoking. The young man wakes up startled and with wide eyes, letting out a sigh of pure panic after reliving that terrible nightmare. Elric sits up quickly in bed, bathed in cold sweat and wielding a knife in a defensive manner against the void. He breathes, gasping for air with his heart racing, still trying to get rid of the traumatic memories of the war. The young man looks at the knife in his trembling hands while trying to get his bearings and calm his combat instincts. Little by little, the sunlight that invades the imposing and luxurious room begins to bring a sense of reality to the environment. He finally realizes that he is no longer on the battlefield, and that he managed to return in safety to his home. Suddenly, knocks on the door startle him and make him point his weapon in the direction of the noise by pure reflex. From outside, a polite voice asks if the young master's already awake while he remains tense on the huge bed. Elric hesitates for a brief moment and maintains silence, trying to control his uneven breathing before answering. He finally answers in a contained manner that yes, confirming that he is already awake. While saying he just woke up, the young man hides the knife quickly behind his back so as not to raise suspicions. One of the dedicated servants enters the room bringing a wooden basin full of water so that he can wash himself. The protagonist remembers that as soon as he asked for cold water to clean himself, a basin overflowing with freezing water was delivered to him without delay. He dresses in incredibly soft and comfortable clothes, feeling as if he were barely wearing anything in comparison to the heavy armor of before. Upon looking at himself in the mirror leaning on his cane, Elric reflects that living surrounded by so much luxury seems like a reward he does not deserve. The young man tries to force a smile before his own reflection, but the result sounds strange and unnatural to him. He begins to walk slowly and wonders if all that time of suffering on the battlefield ended up turning his face into stone. The housekeeper Rhonda opens the door and compliments the young master's look, suggesting shortly after that they start the day with a good breakfast. She stands tall with her impeccable and elegant posture, as always waiting for him to accompany her. Upon noticing the young man's limping walk, the housekeeper asks, worried, what happened to his leg? And he invents the lie that he ended up falling from a steep hill by pure distraction. In his mind, the protagonist remembers how he was injured in the war and recognizes that he could never tell that a bullet remained lodged in his knee so as not to cause unnecessary worries. Rhonda comments, amused, that he continues as prone to accidents as in the past, making the young man laugh awkwardly and remember the embarrassing misunderstanding of the previous day. While the two walk through the mansion's corridors, soft footsteps begin to echo and a long-awaited figure appears in their direction. The delicate profile and long golden hair of the young bride are revealed under the soft light that enters through the windows. Theria appears before him in a stunning manner and asks, with sweetness, if he managed to have a good night's sleep. However, the sight of his wife makes the young man remember instantly the moment he saw her coming out of her bath wrapped only in a towel. Completely embarrassed and with his face red, he can barely formulate a decent answer after being called a pervert because of that incident. The young maid, Marie, points her finger dramatically and screams that he is a true deviant, while Tyria stands very awkwardly in the background. Without patience for that scandal, Rhonda hits Marie's head with a strong tap and scolds her harshly for having been spying on someone else's bathhouse. While dragging the noisy maid away from there by her collar, the housekeeper wishes politely that the young man has a pleasant stay in the mansion. Feeling somewhat uncomfortable with the warm reception, Elric clears his throat to try to dissipate the heavy atmosphere. He forces a friendly smile and wishes a good morning to his wife, commenting in a relaxed manner that he managed to sleep very well. While observing the cozy environment of the dining room, the young man notices Marie's absence and asks the name of the new maid for not remembering her from his last visit. However, he almost spits out what he was eating and slaps his hand on the table out of pure shock when Tyria mentions the incident where the maid called him a pervert. Desperate to end the subject, the protagonist gestures frantically with his hands and insists that she does not need to worry about that. He rests his hand firmly on the handle of his cane, trying to regain his composure before the embarrassing situation. With a visibly flushed face, Elric tries to explain himself, saying it was just a silly curiosity for never having seen the girl before. Tyria stares at him with a half-closed and extremely sharp look, appearing not to be totally convinced by that hurried excuse. An embarrassing silence soon settles in the environment while the couple begins to have breakfast side by side. The young bride savors the meal with tranquility and chews calmly, appearing oblivious to the tension that hangs in the air. Suddenly, she opens her mouth to talk about a delicate subject, leaving the young man instantly on alert. Taking advantage of the opening, Elric takes the initiative and decides to address, once and for all, the terrible misunderstanding of the previous day. Tyria asks shyly if he is referring to what happened in the bathhouse, feeling her cheeks heat up at the same time. The young man tries to stutter a formal apology, but she interrupts him quickly with a nervous gesture to end the conversation. Still quite embarrassed, the young lady asks only for him to concentrate on eating and finish his breakfast soon. Tyria looks away and squeezes her own dress with trembling hands. Completely awkward with that entire intimate situation, she remains in absolute silence with her face flushed, unable to face her husband directly in the eyes. Feeling the atmosphere become increasingly heavy, the protagonist scratches the back of his neck and mentally curses his own idea of bringing the subject up. He remembers how he was wearing only a robe in the bathhouse and realizes that he ended up exposing himself too much. Elric recalls with bitterness the countless deep scars that cover his body, questioning himself as she ended up being shocked by the marks of his violent past in the war. The two continue eating in an almost ear-splitting silence where only the sound of cutlery against the plates can be heard. The young man deeply regrets not having simply ignored what occurred, feeling that embarrassing atmosphere will end up driving both of them crazy. To escape from there as quickly as possible, he begins to stuff food into his mouth in an extremely hurried and almost desperate way. With his cheeks totally full, the young man cleans his mouth in a hurry while his wife watches him in complete shock with that sudden lack of manners. Giving a thumbs up, the young man announces with his mouth full that he is already leaving and wishes for her to finish enjoying the meal. He stands up quickly and leaves the dining room, closing the wooden door right behind him with a soft click. Tyria watches the closed door for a few moments and lets out a shy sigh before her husband's unexpected attitude. With her face still red, she looks at the sunny window and wishes in thought that he has a pleasant day. Upon stepping into the main hall after breakfast, Elric notices that the immense Portman property is already in full operation and full of servants working. Under the attentive guidance of the housekeeper, Rhonda, the young man begins to greet each of the house employees who receive him with sincere smiles and a lot of sympathy, making another employee scold him, saying that the two are married and praising the young master's virility. Suddenly, young Marie emerges furious in the middle of the hallway and screams at the top of her lungs that the protagonist is nothing more than a big pervert. She rails indignantly for all the other employees to wake up and stop defending the young man's suspicious attitudes. The young maid continues her scandal, saying that he disappeared for 10 years only to return with this type of behavior, but she is interrupted when a firm hand holds her shoulder. It is the elderly Aldeo, who appears smiling and asks for her not to be so hard on the young master for her still being too young to understand these things. The experienced employee explains naturally that the main duty of any noble is to ensure a legitimate heir for the family's lineage. Aldeo argues enthusiastically that Elric was only fulfilling his marital obligations faithfully in the bathhouse, and that he proved to be a true noble by not forgetting his duties even after a decade away. The young man is completely mortified with the embarrassing conversation, while Marie continues protesting with shouts that he is the worst of deviants. The friendly gentleman ignores the girl's protests and asks with expectation if the young master finally returned home for good, making Elric let out a very awkward laugh. Holding the handle of his cane firmly, the protagonist reflects in silence that in truth he still has not made any decision about his future. He knows that the serious injury to his knee will force him to remain in the mansion for some time, but he questions how he could act as the legitimate lord of that beautiful property surrounded by golden wheat fields after so many years away. Trying to change the subject, Elric warns that he needs to settle some commitments now and that they will talk better later, receiving a respectful nod from Aldeo, who celebrates his return. Shortly after, the young master orders the experienced employee to prepare the carriage for his immediate departure. A short time later, the vehicle begins to move softly along the dirt road that cuts through the immensity of the farm's golden fields. From the middle of the wheat plantation, Tyria observes in silence the carriage moving away slowly toward the property's exit. She holds her large straw hat against the soft breeze of the day, maintaining a thoughtful and melancholic gaze while observing the horizon. Seen from above, the carriage follows its lonely path along the road surrounded by the vibrant colors of autumn that the vehicle finally stops at an isolated point on the hill, and Elric gets out to walk slowly with the aid of his cane. The young man observes the silent landscape with an expression loaded with melancholy and mutters to himself that it really has been a long time. He stops before the imposing stone tomb of Hovan Portman and whispers with deep sadness the word father, staring at the headstone under the brilliant light of the sky. Before the headstone, the protagonist reflects silently that he used to carry a deep resentment toward his late father. However, he confesses that he never wished for the reunion between them to happen in that cold and melancholic manner. Hovan Portman had been an extremely determined man who raised the family's lineage from mere merchants to the most important guild in Wyvern, but his relentless coldness also earned him countless enemies throughout his life. The young man questions himself if his father ever once gave him a sincere smile or a single word of affection, concluding that he should have lived a little longer if he wanted to maintain his villainous posture until the end. He fixes his eyes on the coat of arms carved into the funerary monument, and laments silently that his father passed away so soon. With a light sigh, Elric decides to look away from the tomb and prepares to turn his back on that place under the blue sky. The young man admits to himself that he no longer carries the hurt and resentment of the past that used to torment his heart. The young man then turns slowly and calls the attention of Aldeo, who was waiting patiently a little further behind. He asks directly how his father passed away, and the loyal employee answers that the cause was a serious heart disease that afflicted him. Elric is surprised to learn that the late man hid the truth about his health state until the end, with only the personal doctor and Aldeo himself knowing the situation. The employee continues the account, explaining that, upon noticing the proximity of his final days, Hovan dedicated all his strength to closing and liquidating his businesses. With a light, ironic smile, the young man comments that he finds the employee a curious figure and asks what he saw in that man so cold to maintain such loyalty. Without hesitation, Aldeo smiles back and answers in a humorous manner that he did everything for money, questioning what other reason he could have. The protagonist stares at him with suspicion and observes that he still has not asked him the most important question of all. He refers to the fate of all the assets and wealth that the late man liquidated hurriedly before his premature death. The young man maintains a serious expression while waiting for the revelation about the whereabouts of the family's immense fortune. The elderly employee then reveals that all the inheritance accumulated by his father was bequeathed entirely to him, the legitimate heir. The carriage resumes its march and advances slowly along the dirt road that cuts through the beautiful forest with autumn leaves. Already settled inside the vehicle, Elric asks the coachman if his father really did not leave any formal written will. Aldeo answers that the late man was not the type who would do something like that and confirms that there are only some written instructions about the sharing, offering to show them if he has any curiosity. Gripping his cane firmly, the young man listens to the employee admit that the late man's true intentions remain a great mystery to everyone. The coachman adds that the matter was treated with a coldness never seen before by the old boss, leaving the protagonist quite thoughtful. While the carriage crosses the golden plantation, the elderly man advises the young man to take all the necessary time to reflect on the fate of the inheritance. The young man focuses his red gaze on the landscape and begins to connect the dots about his family's current situation. An intriguing questioning arises in his mind while he observes the wheat plantation through the vehicle's window. Elric wonders for what reason his wife still remains in the mansion since the arranged marriage should have been annulled after his long absence of 10 years. Aldeo comments from outside that that marriage was purely political, functioning as a commercial transaction disguised as a union between two noble families. The young man questions if that fact would be sufficient justification, but is interrupted by the elderly man who remembers a very important detail he had forgotten to mention. He reveals that the Portman lineage has now ascended to the title of hereditary barony, and that this prestigious honor will be transferred to the young man as soon as he assumes the inheritance.